You're sort of known as a bipartisan businessman. I read somewhere that you're very careful about ensuring you make campaign contributions, same amounts on both sides of the aisle. Even I understood counting the number of tweets to make sure you don't seem to favor one side or the other. And that's an interesting position for you to be in because Congress, the United States government, is probably one of the least entrepreneurial organizations. My question is this, though. I think a lot of entrepreneurs I talk to say they don't necessarily want an entrepreneurial government. They want a stable government that gives them the playing field on which to be creative and revolutionary themselves. That's not really what we have now. What do you see your role as? Do you agree with that? And what do you see your role as in trying to bring that about?
Well, my goal is to try to make sure we remain the most innovative entrepreneurial nation. That, at its core, that's really what drives me. And there are various aspects to that right now. A real passion, real focus is on immigration reform. We're not going to be the most entrepreneurial nation if we don't win what is now a global battle for talent. So passing comprehensive immigration reform is critically important. And the only way to get these things done is to build a bipartisan coalition to get them done. And unfortunately, our politics have gotten more polarized in recent decades on the Republican side and on the Democratic side. And there's been sort of a hollowing out of the center where people come together and compromise and try to get things done. And we need to rebuild that center if we're going to have good governance of our nation and solve some of the difficult problems, whether it be fiscal problems or issues related to entrepreneurship like access to capital or regulations, patents, immigration reform, things like that. So it's really important to, I think, rebuild that center. It requires taking a pretty bipartisan approach. And I understand a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly in California, Silicon Valley, don't really want to mess with these. They just want to focus on their businesses, and then when they grow to a certain prominence, they realize, okay, well, I guess now I need to pay more attention. I get that, but I think the world's changing because of this creation of the second internet revolution. Things like education, healthcare. The government is going to be more important. The government is not just the principal regulator of those industries; it's also the principal customer. The government buys more healthcare services, more educational services than anybody else. So if you're going to be an entrepreneur that wants to attack one of those big sectors, you're going to have to understand how policy is made both at the federal level and at the state level and figure out ways to bring your products and services to market that reflect the sort of the interests, desires, constraints, what have you, of your principal customer, which is the government. That is the reality of the world we're moving to as we move away from the first internet revolution, which was just about access, to the second internet revolution, which is really revolutionizing key aspects of our lives in sectors like healthcare and education. There is a role for government to play to support entrepreneurship and innovation. At the end of the day, of course, the market needs to work. Entrepreneurs need to create startups, and some of those startups will fail, but some will be successful and really help drive innovation. And as a result, kind of replenish our corporate world and our economy. You look at the Fortune 500 or things like that; they turn over frequently. There's a constant churning. If you're not creating new companies, you're not creating these new startups, your economy eventually will stagnate. That's the problem in some parts of Europe, for example. Their growth rate has flatlined. We need to make sure we're constantly innovating, constantly growing. That's the work of the startup community. And the government kind of should stay out of actually trying to pick winners in terms of specific technologies or particular startups. But the government has to play a role on things like immigration policy. We're going to win this battle for talent. Only governments can determine immigration policy, who can come in our country and how long they can stay. Only governments can figure out tax policy to incent investments in startups, things like capital gains, incentives, things like that. Only the government can figure out what the right securities regulation should be. One of the things I spent time on was this Jobs Act, Jumpstarting Our Business Startups Act, which legalized crowdfunding and created an on-ramp for IPOs. Only governments can do that, securities regulation. So there is going to be a role for government in the entrepreneurship sector, and an important role if we're going to continue to take the necessary steps to remain the most entrepreneurial nation. I think people in the startup community to understand that and respect that while spending most of their time focusing on their particular product, their particular service, their particular startup.
You had an op-ed not long ago about immigration policy in the Wall Street Journal. Do you see on the horizon any possibility of moving forward on that? I mean, we've got a government that's constantly on the verge of a shutdown at this
Right.
point. It seems almost incapable of taking up serious legislation on something that big and that polarizing.
Well, I'm cautiously.
What's your
I'm
line
cautiously-
between realistic and optimistic on that?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think entrepreneurs are always optimistic. I know the path to getting comprehensive immigration reform passed, this year, is difficult. It's challenging, and some of the issues we've had to deal with Syria, and then more recently with the shutdown of the government or the debt ceiling, things like that, are taking some of the attention away from the debate that needs to happen, particularly in the House right now, on immigration reform. So the calendar that is not working in our favor. But I spent a fair amount of time on this. I think there are a growing number of people in the House who have joined with the people in the Senate who have already passed the comprehensive immigration reform bill. And I'm optimistic that we will see some movement in the House, and hopefully some of the legislation will come out of the House in the next month or two that can be conferenced with the Senate, and hopefully legislation can be signed by the President by the end of the year. I think this is a moment. The people focusing on immigration reform have not seen a moment like this for a decade, and may not see it again for another decade. So we should seize this moment and work together in a bipartisan way to craft a immigration solution that deals with the key issues around entrepreneurship, things like a startup visa and H-1B, also deals with border security, also deals with what do you do with the kids who came here with their parents, what's called the DREAM Act, and also deals with the issue of the undocumented 11 million people who are here. We need a comprehensive solution, and the House will have a little different view of it in the Senate, but together they need to come together, the Senate and the House, Republicans and Democrats, to craft a policy around immigration that deals with this once and for all and positions us to really be a magnet for talent so that we can remain the most entrepreneurial nation. The data here is pretty compelling that 40% of our Fortune 500 companies were started by at least one immigrant. In Silicon Valley, technology companies, a decade ago, 52% had an immigrant founder. Now it's 42%. We've actually lost 10 points in 10 years. Why? Because we made it harder for people to come here or stay here. Other countries have made it easier. So now people that a decade ago would have started a company here are starting companies in other countries. And that's bad, at least for our economy and our innovation engine, because other regions are developing and changing their policies to attract more talent, attract more capital, attract more ideas. And our position in the United States that we've had for quite some time of being the most innovative entrepreneurial nation, it's not guaranteed. It's not something that's like somehow part of the Constitution. America is destined to always be the most entrepreneurial nation. We have been, we can continue to be, but it's going to require the government putting the right policies in place to ensure that. And everybody, including people with startups who are busy focusing on their startups, need to make sure their voices are heard to make sure Congress passes immigration reform.
How much of this passion comes from entrepreneurs that you've mentored in, that you've seen their personal anecdotal experience versus the big data-driven trends that you're talking about? I mean, a lot of people talk about data, but I'm wondering if you have insights from.
Oh, sure, it's a mix. There are stories that I've been exposed to, companies we've invested in or people we've talked to who are struggling. They have an idea, they're trying to grow, but the immigration policies make it more difficult. In some cases, one immigrant founder had to go back to, I believe it was India, to kind of get a update on his visa. Ended up being there for 2 months. He was at a company, he was trying to hire some people in Chicago and was stuck in India because of our immigration policy. And we want to create jobs, and with almost 8% unemployment, I think everybody does want to create jobs. A place to focus on startups. You want to create more economic growth, and right now our economy is growing about 2%. It really needs to grow 3 or 4% if we're ever going to have a path to sort of a sustainable, positive fiscal situation. Well, the place to focus innovation and entrepreneurship and startups. So everybody needs to not think of startups as something off on the side. Isn't it interesting, those entrepreneurs building interesting little companies on the side? They really are central to the future of the country.